Amelia Barbados was born into royalty in the Grand Kingdom of Avalon, an empire known for its vast riches and formidable military might. Her father, King Draken Barbados, ruled the land with an iron fist. His reign was filled with constant wars, public executions, and political purges, fostering an environment of fear and violence within the palace walls. Amelia's mother, Queen Elora, was the softer figure, but even her gentle demeanor could not shield Amelia from the horrors that surrounded her. From an early age, Amelia was exposed to death. She would hear the agonizing cries of prisoners being tortured in the dungeon, smell the scent of blood in the execution yard, and witness the aftermath of battlefield victories, hundreds of slain men brought to the palace gates as a display of the king's power. Despite her privileged upbringing, Amelia's world was cloaked in brutality. The violence became normalized, and with it, her mental state began to warp. Amelia suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, from childhood, though it manifested in subtle ways. While she had the beauty and grace of a princess, she also developed hypervigilance, being constantly on edge, always waiting for the next traumatic event. Her nights were filled with nightmares, where the faces of the tortured haunted her, their screams echoing in her mind. At first, she could mask her discomfort, but as she grew older, it became harder to suppress the darkness brewing inside her. At the age of 16, Amelia experienced her first significant break. During a royal banquet, a servant accidentally spilled wine on her dress. The trivial mistake triggered something deep within Amelia, a reminder of the blood-soaked memories from her childhood. She followed the servant into the kitchen, her heart pounding with an inexplicable fury. As the servant begged for forgiveness, Amelia felt an uncontrollable urge to hurt her, to make her feel the same fear and pain she had lived with for so long. Without thinking, Amelia grabbed a nearby carving knife and stabbed the servant repeatedly. Blood gushed from the young woman's body, staining Amelia's hands. Instead of recoiling in horror, she felt a strange sense of satisfaction, as if the act of violence had granted her control over the terror that had once consumed her. This moment marked the birth of her fascination with blood, a psychological disorder known as hemophilia, where individuals develop an obsession with blood and may seek it out compulsively. After the incident, her parents, particularly her father, covered up the crime. The servant's death was ruled an accident, and Amelia's secret was safe. But inside, she knew that something had changed. She had tasted blood, and she craved more. As Amelia grew older, her violent tendencies only worsened. She became withdrawn, often disappearing from public life for days at a time. Inside the palace, she began targeting young women, maids, handmaidens, and servants. She would lure them to the dungeons, where she reenacted the torture she had witnessed as a child. Amelia developed sadistic personality disorder, a condition where she derived pleasure from inflicting pain on others, reveling in their agony. She found new ways to prolong the suffering of her victims. One of her favorite methods was to tie her captives to a rack, stretching their bodies slowly over hours until their joints dislocated. Their screams fueled her, feeding her deep-seated need for control and dominance. The violence felt cathartic, an outlet for the rage and terror she had suppressed for so long. She began to feel invincible, her royal status shielding her from any consequences. Amelia's mind became consumed with thoughts of death. She would fantasize about new methods of torture, often scribbling grotesque images in her journal, drawings of women dismembered or set ablaze. She would later be diagnosed with paraphilic disorder, a condition in which her arousal was tied to violent fantasies and acts, often directed toward vulnerable individuals. It wasn't long before Amelia's violence took another form. After one particularly brutal murder, she watched her victim's lifeless body with disinterest. It no longer excited her as it once did. Seeking a new thrill, she dragged the corpse into the castle courtyard and set it on fire. The flames danced in her eyes, their warmth and destruction offering her a perverse sense of satisfaction. She was mesmerized by the sight of the body turning to ash. This act sparked a new obsession: fire. Amelia developed pyromania, an impulse control disorder characterized by an obsession with starting fires. She began setting fires regularly, often burning her victims alive before watching their remains turn to charred skeletons. The act of burning became symbolic to her, a way of cleansing her mind of the tormenting memories from her youth. Fire became her companion, offering her a sense of control over life and death. She reveled in the power it gave her, allowing her to erase her victims from existence completely. Over the next decade, Amelia's kill count grew exponentially. She would capture women from neighboring villages, often burning entire homes to the ground to conceal her crimes. She had become a queen of chaos, ruling over her land with terror, her psyche fractured beyond repair. By the time Amelia was 35, her kingdom had become a living nightmare. While the common people whispered of the Dark Queen's atrocities, no one dared challenge her. Her father had passed away, and her mother, broken by years of silence, withdrew to a monastery, leaving Amelia to rule in her stead. Her obsession with blood reached its peak during this time. No longer satisfied with mere killing, Amelia began collecting vials of blood from her victims. She would store them in her private chambers, labeling each one with the name of the woman it belonged to. This was the pinnacle of her hemophilia, as her psychological dependency on the sight and feel of blood had reached a level where she could not function without it. On many occasions, she would drink the blood, believing it granted her strength and longevity. In her delusional state, she began to view herself as a goddess of death, chosen to purify the world of weak and impure souls. Her reign of terror reached across the land, and stories of the Blood Queen spread far beyond her kingdom. Despite the madness, Amelia was careful. She was intelligent and cunning, using her royal influence to cover her crimes, often pinning them on foreign enemies or rebels within the kingdom. She had perfected the art of manipulation, keeping those closest to her in the dark. But no secret can stay hidden forever, and Amelia's bloody reign was nearing its end. Whispers of Amelia's atrocities spread through the kingdom, and eventually, they reached the ears of the royal council. At first, no one believed the rumors. After all, Amelia was the queen, and she had ruled with strength and prosperity for many years. But the disappearances of young women had become too frequent to ignore, and suspicions grew. A group of noble families, fearful for their daughters' safety, pressured the council to launch an investigation. Reluctantly, the council appointed a team of investigators to probe the claims. What they discovered in the dungeons of Amelia's palace shocked them beyond comprehension. The investigators uncovered piles of bones, blood-stained torture devices, and Amelia's private journals detailing her heinous acts. Her secret life was exposed, and the kingdom was thrown into chaos. When confronted, Amelia did not deny her actions. Instead, she smiled, a cold, detached smile, and told the council that she had done what was necessary to rid the world of impurity. Her confession sent waves of terror through the court. She was immediately arrested and stripped of her crown. The trial of Amelia Barbados became the most infamous legal proceeding in the history of Avalon. The people demanded justice for the countless lives she had taken, and the trial drew attention from kingdoms far and wide. Psychologists were brought in to assess Amelia's mental state. Their diagnosis was clear. She suffered from antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, a condition where individuals show no regard for right or wrong, and no empathy for others. Amelia had no remorse for her crimes and viewed her victims as expendable. In addition, she exhibited signs of narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, marked by an inflated sense of self-importance and a lack of empathy for others. Amelia believed she was superior to everyone else, even during the trial, where she often smirked and made contemptuous remarks toward her accusers. Her final diagnosis included hemophilia, pyromania, and sadistic personality disorder, a rare and dangerous combination of psychological disorders that had driven her to commit some of the most gruesome acts imaginable. The trial of Amelia Barbados became a psychological case study for generations to come. While her crimes shocked the world, it was the complex and interwoven nature of her psychological conditions that fascinated experts. Amelia was diagnosed with multiple disorders, each playing a unique role in shaping her violent behavior and insatiable thirst for blood. As the court unraveled her life, psychologists delved deeper into the origins of her cruelty. The diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, helped explain her complete lack of guilt or empathy. From a young age, she displayed traits consistent with the disorder: callousness, impulsivity, and a blatant disregard for human life. Her exposure to violence during her formative years likely exacerbated her tendencies, normalizing the brutal acts she witnessed in the palace. For individuals with ASPD, violence can become an addictive behavior, driven by a desire for power and control. Amelia's sadistic pleasures fed directly into this need, allowing her to dominate others through terror. Her narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, further compounded her psychological unraveling. From childhood, she had been taught to see herself as inherently superior, destined for greatness. Her royal lineage reinforced this belief, fostering a deep sense of entitlement and grandiosity. For Amelia, her victims were merely pawns in her quest for power, tools to reaffirm her delusion that she was a goddess of death. Narcissists often crave admiration and validation, and for Amelia, the act of killing was not just about violence. It was about asserting her dominance and proving her worth as a ruler. But what made her particularly dangerous was her sadistic personality disorder, which linked her emotional satisfaction directly to the suffering of others. Sadists often enjoy the pain they inflict, but Amelia's condition was extreme. She didn't just enjoy inflicting suffering, she thrived on it. Each scream, each drop of blood, was a source of pleasure, and she became addicted to the high it provided. Her condition was further fueled by paraphilic disorder, where her sexual arousal was tied to acts of violence and mutilation. These intertwined disorders created a vicious cycle, where her need for control, pleasure, and power fed her increasingly gruesome acts. During the trial, expert testimony highlighted the pivotal role that childhood trauma played in shaping her psyche. Growing up in a violent environment caused Amelia to develop complex PTSD, a more severe form of post-traumatic stress disorder caused by prolonged exposure to trauma. Complex PTSD can lead to emotional dysregulation, feelings of powerlessness, and difficulty forming healthy attachments, all of which were present in Amelia's relationships, or lack thereof. Her detachment from others made it easy for her to dehumanize her victims, seeing them as objects rather than people. One of the most chilling aspects of her psychological profile was her affinity for fire. As the court examined her repeated use of fire to destroy her victims, it became clear that Amelia suffered from pyromania, an impulse control disorder marked by a pathological obsession with fire. Individuals with pyromania often experience a sense of release or satisfaction when setting fires, and for Amelia, it became an extension of her sadism. Fire allowed her to destroy her victims completely, erasing any trace of their existence, while providing her with a sense of omnipotence. The fire symbolized both her power and her ability to erase life at will. Finally, her obsession with blood, identified as hemophilia, was perhaps the most telling indicator of her mental state. For Amelia, blood was not just a symbol of life and death, it was an object of fascination, something to be revered and consumed. Her fixation on blood hinted at deeper, more primal urges, linked to her need for control over life and death. The sight of blood gave her a sense of power, feeding her delusion that she was in control of the forces of life itself. Psychologists likened her behavior to ancient rituals of sacrifice, where the spilling of blood was seen as a form of divine power. Despite the overwhelming evidence of her psychological disorders, Amelia remained defiant throughout the trial. She refused to acknowledge her crimes as evil, instead framing them as necessary acts of purification. She spoke with a chilling calmness, explaining how each woman she killed was unworthy of life, how their deaths were part of a grander plan to cleanse the kingdom. Her lack of remorse, coupled with her distorted belief in her own righteousness, only reinforced the court's decision. Amelia Barbados was a threat to society and needed to be removed. Amelia was sentenced to life imprisonment in a remote dungeon, far from the kingdom she once ruled. Her imprisonment was as much for her crimes as it was for the protection of the public. The fear that she could manipulate or inspire others to continue her reign of terror was ever present. Guards were ordered to keep a strict watch over her, and any contact with the outside world was strictly prohibited. In the dark confines of her cell, Amelia's psychological conditions worsened. Her antisocial personality disorder made her indifferent to the isolation. She felt no remorse for her actions and had no desire for connection with others. Her grandiosity, a symptom of her narcissistic personality disorder, continued to dominate her thoughts. She fantasized about her escape, about the chaos she would unleash upon the world if given another chance. In her mind, she was still the goddess of death, destined to return and continue her divine mission. Without new victims to torture, her sadistic personality disorder manifested in self-harm. She began to mutilate her own body, carving symbols into her skin with whatever sharp objects she could find. For Amelia, the pain was a substitute for the suffering she once inflicted on others. The sight of her own blood provided temporary relief from the tormenting thoughts that plagued her. Her obsession with blood, now turned inward, became the only source of pleasure in her otherwise monotonous existence. Her pyromania, however, had no outlet in the dungeon. Deprived of fire, Amelia's mind began to deteriorate further. She would sit for hours, staring at the dark walls, imagining the flames she once controlled. The lack of fire fueled her frustration, and she frequently lashed out at the guards, screaming incoherently about the need to cleanse the world with fire. Without her destructive outlet, her mental state spiraled into deeper delusion. As the years passed, Amelia's psychological condition became progressively worse. Her complex PTSD continued to affect her, as she frequently experienced vivid flashbacks of her childhood, reliving the moments of violence she had both witnessed and inflicted. These flashbacks became more frequent and intense, often leaving her in a state of catatonia, where she would be unresponsive for hours, trapped in the memories of her bloody past. In these moments, Amelia would speak to the ghosts of her victims, justifying her actions as necessary. Her dissociative episodes, a symptom of both complex PTSD and antisocial personality disorder, caused her to lose touch with reality. She no longer saw herself as imprisoned, but as a martyr for a cause the world could not understand. Her sense of identity blurred, and she often referred to herself in the third person, as if she were a separate entity from the woman who committed the crimes. The only solace she found was in her blood obsession. With no access to fresh blood, she began to bite her own skin, drawing blood to satisfy her craving. The guards, horrified by her self-inflicted wounds, attempted to restrain her, but Amelia's strength and determination proved formidable. Her hemophilia had become the driving force behind her existence, a psychological need that overpowered even her physical pain. Amelia's mind had fully fractured by this point. Psychologists described her condition as a form of psychosis, where her delusions and hallucinations became indistinguishable from reality. In her mind, she was no longer a prisoner, she was a queen, awaiting the moment when the world would recognize her greatness. The once cunning and calculated ruler had devolved into a shell of her former self, consumed by madness. Amelia Barbados died in her cell at the age of 50, after nearly 2 decades of imprisonment. Her death was not mourned, nor was it celebrated. The Kingdom of Avalon had moved on from her reign of terror, burying the memory of the Blood Queen deep in its history. But her story lived on in the annals of psychological study. Amelia's case became a cornerstone for the study of extreme psychological disorders, particularly the intersection of antisocial personality disorder, sadistic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and pyromania. Her life offered a rare glimpse into the mind of a woman who, driven by trauma and unchecked mental illness, became one of the most prolific killers in history. Her disorders, each feeding off the other, created a perfect storm of violence, delusion, and destruction. Her obsession with blood and fire, combined with her complete lack of empathy, made her a unique case in the study of criminal psychology. Scholars debated for years whether her crimes were a result of her environment or her inherent nature. Some believed that if Amelia had been raised in a different environment, free from violence and trauma, she may have lived a normal,